How's it go, everybody? Today we are back with more Mr.Ballen. This is his final words made him billions. I can't tell you when the last time I have actually watched a Mr.Ballen video. It's been so long.
Today, we're gonna look at 3 stories about real people who at some point in their lives made choices. Now at the time, these choices were fairly innocuous, but eventually those choices would completely change not only their lives, but millions of other people's lives as well. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do.
What happened to your neck?
Once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and change the names of all their contacts to just say spam, so that every call they get, they think it's spam and they don't answer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications.
I almost forgot about
so you
the
don't
like.
miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into
the like shenanigans he always says. Famous last words. Okay.
On January 17th, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside.
It's on death row?
And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space and one chair pushed up against the far back wall.
Oh, yeah.
Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair.
Wow.
So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of this space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station, there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted murderer.
Oh.
He had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, and immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts, he actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die.
Wow.
He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him.
I mean, both options do suck, but I don't think I'd rather be executed. That's all I'm saying. Also, of all things, why would you want your death to be by a firing squad? So that's weird.
After the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready, and then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan and his team to help them do that. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the chance to be huge, he just felt like they lacked something. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so this meeting that Dan was having right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What kind of campaign can we run for this company? And so for hours they sat there pitching different ideas, different concepts of how we can
Is this the same story or a different story entirely? I'm not quite sure.
Elevate this brand. But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least not yet. And so as Dan is beginning to get frustrated, realizing he really doesn't have any great ideas yet, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business.
Of all things.
And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world.
I wonder
the
what
slogan
it is.
that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign
Have it your
was
way.
based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words. Just do it. Dan's client, that small business, was Nike.
What? Are you serious? That's crazy. I would have never known that. Just Do It was actually inspired by his death. That's wild. But that's such a random thing to use for your marketing campaign. I mean, it obviously worked out because Just Do It is very, it's one of the most famous, quotes any brand has ever created, right? But who thinks of this? Seriously. In all of my years, I would have never known this piece of information until this video.
Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballen Studios called Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke Lamana.
Oh, this is a plug. Mr. Ballen probably has a house made out of money at this point. The Shiner.
One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do. And so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, is this okay? And she kind of looked back and smiled like, I get it, it's fine, we can eat here. So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table. And then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here. And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, sure, go ahead. And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine.
Man, don't tell me them making this decision to sit down at this table with this stranger is going to somehow end their life. I know that's drastic, but remember, this is a Mr. Ballen video.
But as they were eating and chatting, Chris, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't. And so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date.
Oh,
and the
my
way he's
God.
looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview and he looks at this guy and he's like, what's going on? Because again, this guy's just staring at his date.
Right.
And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked.
Oh yeah, now it's up. Now I gotta put my hands on you. Bro, that is the weirdest thing to do when you're just trying to sit down with your date at a McDonald's and somebody just immediately starts insulting your date. What? I really hope this guy doesn't pull out a weapon or something and starts beating on Chris and his date.
Talked, and Chris is like, what's going on here? He's looking at his date like, did I miss something? Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago, but then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, you're an ugly pig. And at this, Chris is like, I can't just sit here. And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, hey man, get up. He's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake. Because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris.
Oh.
But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor.
That don't mean shit.
And he kind of looks up at this guy, and he just kind of winds up and hits
The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point. He kept apologizing to his date and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there. And so they left the McDonald's and they both, went to their respective homes. And Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning when Chris got up early because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, I mean, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really
You could literally just make it up. I fell down some stairs. Somebody mistakenly hit me in the face. I don't understand why that would have any bearing on you getting this job or not,
a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good. But it was the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity, and he left thinking, I'm not gonna get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye.
Really?
Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show.
What?
And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights, and so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights.
Wow.
And you're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. he's our guy.
That's crazy.
So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became...
Get the fuck out of here. Are you serious? Game of Thrones? Dude, if this is a Game of Thrones TV show audition that he just got, holy hell.
one of the most popular TV shows
Wow.
in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe
Now,
Awards.
who's the
and Emmy
actor?
Awards. I mean, he truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by
What?
his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed...
You're telling me Jon Snow? That is incredible. That is crazy. I never would have known that the actor that plays Jon Snow, Kit, dude, I never knew he got, what a hell of an opportunity, for one. And given the circumstances that happened the night before, that's just like, damn, dude. What's funny is, like, I don't think many of us could say that an ass whooping changed my life for the better. Like, I don't think many of us could say that. Think about that for a second. Somebody whooped his ass and it made him successful. But I'm not, like, all jokes aside, though, that was a I don't know, like a miracle. Like, he was doing the right thing and standing up for his date, and this guy, pulverized him. But, at the same time, it just all worked out. I need some of that luck, bro. Are you kidding me? How lucky can you be, man? Damn.
his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones.
I wonder if he ever thanked the guy for whooping his ass. Hey, thank you, bro, for whooping my ass and dodged my eyes, man. I'm successful as hell. I'm Jon Snow. You know what's funny is that guy probably has watched Game of Thrones. He's like, wait a minute, that guy looks familiar. That's crazy, though. One drink, two drink. Let's hope this story is just as wholesome.
One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted
Did
was
Mr. Ballen
inside of
get
his
hit
dorm
by a
room at
paintball?
Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands on a bottle of gin, and so tonight they were just sitting around, drinking this gin,
Sipping on
having a great
gin
time.
and juice.
Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. I mean, literally, they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter that they were 21 years old. At the time, in the United States, in 1925, the country was in the middle of prohibition, which meant no one was allowed to possess or consume alcohol. It was actually illegal. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was a senior in college and was getting ready to graduate with honors. And also, he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine called Jack-O-Lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. I mean, he had aspirations of graduating and becoming a professional writer and publisher, and it just felt like everything was falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories. It was a lot of fun, but at some point, they heard a knock on their door.
Uh-oh.
And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my God, are we in trouble now?
Hide the gin.
Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by and hang out with us. And so Ted, he gets up, he goes
And
to
the
the door,
Coke.
and his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there.
And the
He
weed.
opens the door, and it's not friends, it's two police officers. And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail. And also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars.
Damn.
Which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. In fact, he was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken. Less so about the academic honors and much more so about being, cut off from the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow.
Right.
Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, But the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published.
Perhaps.
And so that's exactly what Ted began doing. And the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from this pseudonym, they thought it was some new person they had never heard of. And they were so wowed by the work, they're like, this is great. And they began publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. And for Ted, oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name, kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this ruse for the rest of the time he was at Dartmouth, and then after he graduated, he just continued to write under this pen name. Throughout the rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books, all under this pen name, a name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college.
And that's going to be one of the most famous names that you've probably heard about in the world, probably. Don't tell me he's like Dr. Seuss or something, right?
Books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but I'm sure
I
you
knew
know him
it!
better by his pen name, which is Dr. Seuss.
I had no idea it was actually Dr. Seuss, bro. It's really Dr. Seuss. That's so funny, bro. But that's interesting. That's interesting.
In case you haven't heard,
he almost wasn't Dr. Seuss until he thought about doing that workaround, I should say. Oh, okay. This was definitely more interesting than scary, but I'm cool with that. Most of the time I watch Mr.Ballen for just his scary content. But anywho, guys, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you head to Mr. Ballen's channel and like his videos and support his channel. And if you enjoyed my reaction, give me a thumbs up, share, and subscribe. I'll be back. More reactions. Peace!